It's time now for our community affairs show. I'm Cheryl Jackson, and I love talking to the Alzheimer's Association. You guys know that. So periodically throughout the year, we always bring them on for the community affairs show to give updates and just to get insight. This is one of the diseases that I really champion behind, and it's really personal. And we've gotten a lot of great feedback from listeners who's learning so much. So this time we have with us Laura Byer. Now, she's the program manager for the Alzheimer's Association National Capital Area Chapter. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
You're very welcome. We also have with us Sarah Harris. She's Alzheimer's Association support group leader and volunteer Alzheimer's ambassador to Senator Mark Warner. And we're glad to have you today as well, Sarah. How are you?
I am well. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to let people know what's happening.
Exactly. And again, we're going to jump right in. So, Laura, we often think that Alzheimer's is a disease that affects, the older adults, but that's not always the case. So what is younger onset Alzheimer's and who does it affect?
So you're right. We often think of people who are older because as you age, your risk for Alzheimer's increases. However, there are a group of people who do get Alzheimer's in their 40s, their 50s. Anybody who gets Alzheimer's before the age of 65 is what we refer to as somebody that's got early onset Alzheimer's.
Got you. And the population of people who's getting this younger is Alzheimer's?
So these, are people that have families, careers. They could even be caregivers themselves for their parents or for their children. And they're in the prime of their life working. So very few of these people are getting Alzheimer's due to genetics. It's most likely environment and other factors.
And I'm glad you pointed that out because, people was calling Alzheimer's old timers, right?
Right.
You hear people say that often because they think it is a disease for the older population.
And if I could just say that Alzheimer's and dementia, Alzheimer's is a subset of dementia. Alzheimer's is the type of dementia that occurs most frequently with up to 7 in 10 of those with dementia have Alzheimer's. However, there are over, 100 other types of dementia.
My mother had vascular dementia. And so we know that that's also one of the higher percentages of dementias. And Alzheimer's is a type of it, but it's just the most common type, right?
Right, right.
All right. So we also have Sarah on. Sarah, your husband, Ernie, was diagnosed with younger onset Alzheimer's. So what symptoms did you notice that alerted you that something was wrong? And did Alzheimer's ever cross your mind during that time?
Yeah, I will try to answer this for you. There were several things that happened that brought my attention to there being a problem. We had only been married for 2.5 years when I began noticing some unusual behaviors. Ernie seemed more confused and vacant. People talk about the vacant stare of people with Alzheimer's, and this was happening more and more often. We had also, as I said, just been married, so my daughter, who was 20, was in college, but my sons were 8 and 12 when he was diagnosed. And Ernie had moved from living on a boat to being married, having a house. There were a lot of life-altering changes for him, so I was thinking, well, maybe he was just overwhelmed. But then other people were noticing that they were wondering what was going on because his behaviors were so erratic at times. Not often, but when they were, it was noticeable. One of the things I first noticed was when our family was playing board games. We like to play games. And he was confused as to which direction to go. He was having trouble adding up numbers. For instance, playing Yahtzee. And the highest number you have to add up to is 30 when you're playing the game. And he couldn't figure out how to do that or write the numbers in. And even the children were noticing him and were reminding him of what to do So therefore, there was no more scorekeeping for him. He couldn't seem to do it. So these were just little things. But then he was having issues with the television, turning it on and off, successfully changing the channels. He couldn't record shows anymore. So he was frustrated. And, we just kept on. And it happened infrequently enough. But one day I was off for a few hours. I came home and he was supposed to be making spaghetti sauce. And I thought when I walked in the house, I would smell it, simmering on the stove, but that wasn't the case. All the ingredients were neatly stacked in little piles on the counter, not even on plates, just on the counter. And he didn't know what to do once he'd cut everything up and prepared everything. Wow. Everything was there. So this was a little shocking. And then he'd had a fender bender on the Beltway, and we were all in the car with him. And I could see what was happening, but he couldn't react quickly enough to avoid hitting the car. And then another time, he turned left onto the wrong side of a divider in the road when he was taking the boys someplace, and it caught their attention. And when they got home, they wasted no time, telling me what had happened. So therefore, my anxieties were heightened at this point. And these were no longer just annoying behaviors, but safety was now an issue. And it wasn't unusual for him to leave for work every morning and then to come back, within 30 to 40 minutes because he'd forgotten his badge or his computer or his lunch. So I became more vigilant, reminding him of what he needed. But he would also come home from work, which was not typical for him, and sit down and immediately fall asleep. So I think we were in the beginning stages of denial, at that point. So I was becoming increasingly worried. I considered bringing my concerns to the attention of his coworkers, but I actually decided not to do that, hoping that nobody else was noticing that he was not himself. But of course they did. Eventually I received a call from his supervisor. He was saying that Ernie was no longer able to do his work. It was not a surprise to me, but it was still a shock because when somebody else was mentioning it, he knew it was real. So work sent us to see a therapist, and they wanted to rule out depression or other health issues. At the end of one and only appointment with her, we left with her words echoing in my ears saying, well, it's either a brain tumor or Alzheimer's disease. And believe it or not, I was hoping for a brain tumor because I knew that Alzheimer's had no cure. Right. And 3 weeks later, he was actually diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And so I had started reading about Alzheimer's, and many of the behaviors described absolutely fit what was happening, what I was seeing happening. But he was only 53. He was way too young. And how could this possibly be true? And so I found out that day our world was changing.
53, and you were only married for about 2 years when you first started seeing symptoms.
We had, and I was only 43.
I knew that younger onset Alzheimer's was a thing, but then to hear the stories, right, and how people navigate that, because, the Alzheimer's would be the last thing that you would think. So.
Oh, absolutely. And it was such a shock. Even though I had done the reading, I had kind of prepared myself, but you still can't believe that somebody that age could have Alzheimer's.
Thank you for sharing your story. I know this is going to help a number of people who's listening because some families could be going through the same situation. You can't rule out the fact that it can be Alzheimer's. So, Laura, is getting a diagnosis different or more challenging for someone with younger onset Alzheimer's?
Absolutely. And Sarah, what a warrior you are. Yeah. Thank you for sharing your story. And Sarah mentioned it is more difficult to get a diagnosis when you're younger because it's not something that's top of mind for doctors. And so, and even for somebody like Sarah, who was seeing the signs, reading about it, it's a stretch. So while doctors understand that there is early onset, there's so many other things that are focused on probably first, like depression, like maybe a combination of medications. And so this can often lead to misdiagnosis or incorrect treatment. And more than ever, it is so important to get a diagnosis because for the first time, we do have medications that are approved for people in the early stages. So that taking this medicine can allow them to stay in the early stage, which is when somebody is at their most cognizant. So we suggest that family members who are concerned should take their loved one to a doctor, accompany them, and ask for cognitive testing.
You're right, because if you're now being diagnosed with something different, now you got to go through the different medicines, the different types of things that they think that might be happening, which is literally chipping away at the time that they could be treating this disease. So I understand, why it could be, prolong it and can make it even worse for them to realize that this is exactly what's happening.
As part of a yearly physical, doctors should definitely be doing some testing to assess your cognitive abilities as well. And so if this is not happening, it doesn't take long. There are very short tests. But this is absolutely something that you should ask for so that you can get baseline cognitive testing.
So when we do our yearly checkups, we can ask for specific tests and specific things. And so, when you ask for them, Laura, then doctors are going to wonder, are you having any cognitive issues? Are you, and as we age, we do, right? We forget things.
Right.
You know what I mean? We literally walk in one room and say, why did I come in here? And because of that doesn't mean that it's Alzheimer's, but we do want to make sure that, that we are getting tested even as early as, in our 40s, our 20s and 30s even.
Right. And signs are different for each individual. But the most important thing to consider is, take Ernie, for example. He had been somebody that was able to play board games, and then suddenly he's not sure of the rules. That is a sign. The driving and confusion, places where you typically went, that is a sign. One of the symptoms of Alzheimer's is that people's experience of depth perception changes. So that is when Sarah's talking about driving, it's much more difficult for people to drive because they don't judge the distances the way they used to.
So with younger's onset Alzheimer's being so uncommon, what challenges did you face finding resources and support as a caregiver for someone with the disease?
As soon as we were back from the doctors after Ernie was diagnosed, I, called my mother and my parents to let them know what was going on. And the first thing my mother said to me was call the Alzheimer's Association. So I actually did call them the day after the diagnosis. When I look back now, I'm like, I can't believe I did that. But it was probably the best phone call I made. The people I spoke with were extremely helpful. They sent me information. They told me about Alzheimer's-related events and about support groups and even spousal groups. And the support groups were very helpful. The other caregivers understood what it was like to live with somebody with Alzheimer's disease. And I was always the youngest person in the support groups I was attending at that time. Because with my children, it posed different problems because I was still a caregiver for them. And most of the people in the groups I was attending were in their 60s, 70s, and even 80s. And the interesting thing is that they were worried about me and how I was coping and how I was handling everything I was doing. And I was worried about them because they were older, and how could they do the heavy lifting and all the things that needed to be done. And so the Alzheimer's Association asked me if I would like to run a support group. And he was still alive at that time. And I said, I just can't do it while Ernie is alive.
Mm-hmm.
So it was just too raw, too emotional. And even, sometimes it's the little things that remind me of what it was like. And it can bring tears to my eyes at very unexpected times. So anyhow, I also realized I couldn't leave the children and Ernie another night to go and do another support group. It was too important for me to attend, one or two a month.
Mm-hmm.
And Ernie actually died in less than 5 years after he was diagnosed. But he had also had it probably for years prior. And looking back, I can even remember things. I lived in Maine when we were dating. He was in Maryland, and he traveled by train to be able to, visit one weekend. And his computer was stolen or lost. And knowing what I know now, I realize he had no idea what had happened to it.
Mm-hmm.
So I was ready after he died in less than a year to do a support group because I realized the importance of a support group or how important the support groups were for caregivers, and especially the younger onset Alzheimer's diagnosed folks, because there were no available groups at that time. Many people had lost their jobs. They had children at home. I, at one point, was working 3 jobs just so I could be available for my children after school. I was took on doing childcare after school and made sure that my other work was something that I would be home while they were home. Also, I think it was the support groups were so good because we could listen to each other as we navigated this horrible disease and learn from each other. And I think that was, one of the most important things. You'd always think, oh my goodness, how can I get through this? But others would have ideas for coping. So in the support group too, everybody would get a chance to share their stories, what had been happening for the last, 2 to 4 weeks, depending on how frequently the support groups were. I think the most important thing is that we all understood what the others were going through. The diseases are different for each person diagnosed with Alzheimer's, but we could understand each other. And in the support groups, it was cathartic because we could laugh and cry, and that happened. But we had a lot of laughter, too, at the antics our loved ones were doing.
Mm-hmm.
People who were not living with disease might not think some of those things were funny, but honestly, if we didn't laugh, the alternative at that point was to cry.
Right.
So laughter became our best friend, and the children knew that, too. We were not laughing at Ernie, but we were laughing with him or laughing at whatever was occurring.
I totally get it. The Alzheimer's Association was key for me in finding resources and how to navigate, because you know, with the support groups, you realize you're not the only one dealing with this, right? Like, you have a community of people.
Exactly.
And like you, I had to literally stop all the things I was doing. The only thing I literally was able to do while my mom was diagnosed was what it was work. And then I would spend, even being married and, Sam's generation. So I'm married and I have children as well. I was literally leaving work and spending time with my mom, and my husband kind of did everything at home. Like, that particular time I was almost absent, you know what I mean, at home, because you get so focused on what you have to do and what your roles are. So, with having 2 young boys and, and being married to Ernie, how did your role as wife and mother change? Like, how was you able to navigate all of that?
Oh, family dynamics changed the moment he was diagnosed.
Yeah.
I grieved for a future that was rapidly changing. I realized right away that things would never be the same.
Mm-hmm.
My dreams for the future with my husband had vanished.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had to tell the children, and that was not easy because I knew that they were aware of changes, but none of us actually understood what would be happening in the future. But I think part of telling them, too, I think it was probably some relief to them to know that his behaviors were not their fault. It was a confusing time, as he was less able to follow directions and different things like that. But the children were worried. They wanted to know what Ernie would do if he wasn't working. How would we have money to live?
Mm.
Would we have to move? Could their friends still come over to play? And that was really important. And of course they could. But I think that became difficult at times because Ernie would, see the children and he would go over. He was losing his ability to talk pretty rapidly. But he would go over and just stand and stare at the children, whether they had friends here or not. And that could be a little unnerving to anybody. But my marriage changed because there were more responsibilities. The decisions were all mine. Whenever I did try to involve him in decision making, I would kick myself. That was a mistake because he really didn't understand.
You're right. When my mother had it, I went to her for everything, with my marriage, with my children. Like, how should I go and what should I do? Recipes. Even now, certain things I make, I'm like, Lord, I wish I could call Mom and ask how she would do this, And
exactly. And
totally get it.
Yeah, the financial decisions were probably the hardest thing to make. I was worried about money. I didn't know, what was going to happen. And, but I had nobody to talk to about it because it's not the type of thing you want to talk about with your friends necessarily. Yeah. And although he was not a child, he was rapidly regressing. He needed help getting dressed, feeding, helping him to even drink a glass of water. And what I found out, too, that Alzheimer's is a lonely disease. And that was something that really surprised me because there were people who were regular and came to see him, but there were lots of people who didn't. We, as a couple, we weren't being invited places very often. And then he did end up having to go to a facility for the last year and a half of his life, and that was probably the hardest decision. And I was the only person who could make that decision. But there were also some, as I like to say, sweet moments, I guess. Ernie loved to play the piano, and we'd sit down and he'd, play a few tunes, and it wasn't always done perfectly, but he was playing, he was enjoying it, he would sing. And then one day I said, well, let's sit down and play the piano. He sat down, he put his hands on the keys, and he didn't know what to do. He said, I don't know how. I can't do it. And that was a very sad day for me. He also, towards the end, did not always know who I was, but I think he always knew I was a special person in his life. One Christmas Eve, he actually was able to sing, and he hadn't been talking much at all for a couple of years. And he was able to sing every Christmas carol that we were singing. And I realized that was a gift to me because who knew he would be able to do that? And when he'd hear a waltz on the radio or we'd play music, he would pull me in his arms and dance. That's something he never lost. And he was doing that up until just a few weeks before he passed. It was also, a spontaneous hug from I would get a spontaneous hug from him very rarely. But when that happened, it's like you take every moment that you get. And probably a year before he died, he said to me, I love you. And to me, it was that kept me going.
Music is, the power of music is just incredible. And we do have groups that people can join where people sing together. And if anybody is interested in finding out about any of the support groups, I would invite people to phone our helpline at 800-272-3900 or visit our website, alz.org/NCA, and you can get a list of all of our support groups there.
Awesome. I want to jump into Laura because we're coming to the end of our community affairs show, but you have a webinar coming up in a few weeks that focuses on living with younger onset Alzheimer's. Tell us about it and how our listeners can participate.
Yes, we have an open forum that is going to be held on Wednesday, April 23rd at noon Eastern Time. And that forum is going to feature a neurologist from Inova Health System, Dr. Jennifer Palderai, talking about the brain and what specifically happens with early onset. And we're going to have our own Karen Fagan, Director of Health Systems, talking about changes that are coming to health systems to increase wraparound care for those who have a diagnosis. And then we're going to have one of our volunteers, Michael Razi, who is actually somebody that has an early onset diagnosis, and he is going to speak about his lived experience. And anybody can attend. However, you must register by calling 800-272-3900 and mentioning that program, which again is Navigating Life with Early Onset, and it's Wednesday, April 23rd at noon, and then they will register you and send you the link.
Wonderful, wonderful. All right, we're coming to the end of our show today, and I want to give you final thoughts. Laura, what can our listeners do to help fight Alzheimer's, being as though you're a volunteer and also work with some of the area organizations?
There are so many ways to help. We have a bicycle ride called the Alzheimer's Association Ride to End Alz, and it's a cycling event. It is the fourth annual ride, and in the nation's capital, it's going to be held Saturday, May 3rd. It will start and finish at McGovern Park in Leesburg. To register for that, people should call or they should go to the website alz.org/RIDEDC, all one word, RIDEDC. 100% of the proceeds that are raised will go directly to research, to finding a cure.
Got you. Laura, you have any final words?
No, I just want to thank you so much.
Sarah, any final words?
Well, I think that utilizing resources is very, very important because Alzheimer's is what is known as the long goodbye. And the more resources you have and the more knowledge, I think it helps make it easier to navigate
Got you.
Alzheimer's.
Wonderful. Don't forget the
Thanks.
Alzheimer's Association has a 24-hour helpline. You could call 800-272-3900. That's 800-272-3900. And of course, as Laura said, you can go to alz.org/NCA to find more information. Laura, Sarah, thank you so much. We appreciate you being here today.
Thank you. And thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
I love it. We will always support and bring more information with regards to the Alzheimer's Association. They have their facts and figures that's coming out for the year to give us updates and statistics about the success of finding a cure for Alzheimer's, the success of what they're finding in research and updating us. In weeks coming, we will bring them back on to get that information. That is our Community Affairs show today. I'm Cheryl Jackson on Praise 104.1 and Magic 102.3 and 92.7.